Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome to those joining us on Zoom, on Facebook, on YouTube, as we take a minute to soak in the Shabbat, resting from a week actively engaging with the world. We turn our attention to the candles, and we begin our Shabbat service with candle lighting.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu להדליק נר של Shabbat.
Amen. After lighting the candles, the last bit of work we do during the week, we turn our attention to greeting the Shabbat, Lechuna Ranana, page 130. 130.
Lechuna Ranana l'Adonai Nari'a letzor Ishenu Nekadma fanav Betoda Bizmirot Nari'a lo Nekadma fanav Betoda Bizmirot Nari'a lo Shiru l'Adonai Shir Chadash Shiru l'Adonai Kol ha'aretz Shiru l'Adonai Baruchu Shemo Basru miyom leyom Yeshuato
We turn our pages to 134 for Zamru.
Zamru l'Adonai bechinu b'kol zimra b'chatzotzot b'kol shofar hariu לפני המלך אדוני ירום הים ומלואו תבל ויושבי בה הידי נהרות עמך וכף יחד הרים ירננו לפני אדוני כי בא לשפוט הארץ ישפוט תבל בצדק העמים במאה שערים ירום הים ומלואו תבל ויושבי בה הידי נהרות עמך וכף יחד הרים ירננו יחד הרים ירננו.
We turn the page to 136 for Mizmor LeDavid.
מזמור לדוד אב לאדוני בני אלים מזמור לדוד אב לאדוני בן מאוד ואור שמו. הבו לאדוני כבוד ועוז, הבו לאדוני כבוד שמו. איי איי די 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 די
Before we start Lecha Dodi, we turn and focus and channel all of our energy to welcoming the Shabbat with the understanding that true Shabbat, true rest, is not something we can simply expect to magically happen in a moment on Friday afternoon, but Shabbat is something that has to actively be sought after, actively greeted. We turn to page 138 to welcome the Shabbat, Lecha Dodi.
לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. דודי לקראת קלה, Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, b'nei Shabbat nekabela. Shamor v'zachor b'diur echad, ishmi'anu alei yochad. Adonai echad u'shmo Hashem לתפארת ולתהילה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת קלה, פני שבת נקבלה. בואי בשלום עטרת
Turn the page to 140 for Mizmor Shir.
מה גדלו מעשיך היה, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך. מה גדלו מעשיך היה, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך.
We turn to page 144 for the Kaddish beginning the Mariv service, Shal Shabbat.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה,
Amen.
בעלמא דברה קרתי והמליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל.
ובזמן קריב אמרו אמן. יהי שמרה במבורך לעולם עולם מעלמיה. יתברך יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה
Yamiran Be'alma Vimru.
Amen. We rise and face east for Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Leolam Va'ed. You may be seated. We continue on page 148. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'bo marivim b'chachma potech sharim u'b'tunah mishneh itim u'machlif et hazmanim eseder et hakochavim b'mishmartehem b'rakia k'retzonaho b'rei yom v'layla golel or mipnei choshech v'choshech v'pnei ohor u'mavir yahom u'mei v'layla u'mavdio b'yom v'layla Adonai tzavot shemaho el chai v'kayam tamid yimoch aleinu li'olam va'ed. Baruch Ata Adonai Hamariv Aravihim Ahavat Olam Beit Yisrael Amecha Ahavta Torah Mitzvot Chukim U'Shnatim Otanu Lamdata Al Kain Adonai Eloheinu B'Shkavenu Uvkumenu Nasiach B'chukacha V'nismach B'divrei Toratecha V'totecha Li'olam Va'ehed Ki Hem Chayenu V'yorech Yamenu V'hem Yegeh Yaman V'layla V'avatacha Al Tashem Imenu Li'olamihim Baruch Ata Adonai Ohev Amo Yisrael. We turn to 152 for Shema.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם, ושבתך בביתך ובמלאכתך בדרך ובשכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך.
למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. We continue on page 156. ואמונה כל זאת וקיים עלינו, כי הוא אדוני אלוהינו ואין זולתנו ואנחנו ישראל עמו. הבודנו ביד מלאכים מלכנו הגואלנו, מכף כל הארצים העושה גדולות עד אין חקר, נפלאות עד אין מספר. השם נפשנו בחיים ולא נתן למות רגלינו, עושה לנו ניסים בפרעה, אותות ומופתים באדמת בני חם. ויוציא את עמו ישראל מתוכם לחירות העולם, וראו בניו גבורתו שיבחו והודו לשמו, ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם. משה בני ישראל לך ענו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם. מי כמוך on page 158.
מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילות אוסף אלה.
מלכותך ראו בניך בקיים לפני משה, זה אלי ענו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ונאמר כי אדוני את יעקב וגאלם יהיה חזק ממנו. ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל. We turn to 160 for Hashkivenu.
השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו לשלום, והעמידנו שומרנו לחיים. השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו לשלום, והעמידנו שומרנו.
Sukkot Shalom Aleinu B'al Kol Amo Yisrael B'al Yerushalayim. We turn for Visharmu on 162.
Shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם.
ושמרו
בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם.
ביני ובין בני ישראל, אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני, עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ.
ושמרו
בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. We turn to page 164 and rise for the silent Amidah. אדוני שפתי תפתח, ופי יגיד, תהי תהילתך.
Open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל, ואמרו אמן.
Amen. We turn to page 371 for Mishaberach, keeping in mind anybody this Shabbat that's in need of any type of healing, be it a physical healing, spiritual, mental healing, or anybody battling any type of addiction. Mishaberach, page 371.
Mishaberach Avotenu Mekol habracha le'imotenu. May this be the source of strength, who bless the ones before us. Help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Mishaberach imotenu mekol habracha le'avotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen.
You may be seated. So we could imagine the scene. It's been 40 long years of wandering through the desert since we last caught up with our biblical protagonists. And all of a sudden, in this week's Parsha Chukat, we're introduced to a new generation. This is a generation that knew not any of the slavery and servitude in Egypt. This is a generation that has been born and raised in the desert. And so we can imagine, like a movie scene, we get the subtitles saying 40 years later. And we zero in on what's going on in the Israelites' camp. And immediately, 40 years after where we left off, we get biblical deja vu. Because what happens in the middle of this week's Torah portion, we have the death of Moses' sister, Miriam. And Miriam was responsible for all of the water in the camp. And so Miriam dies, Miriam passes away, and all of a sudden there's a lack of water. And yet again, we find ourselves in a similar circumstance where Moses, as the leader of the Israelites, is in need of finding water. Now, like Southern California, the desert in the Sinai is not an easy place to get water. So Moses is given this difficult task of finding water in the desert. But we remember, if we remember back several months from our Parshiot, all the way back to Exodus 17, our deja vu hits. Because in Exodus 17, right after the Israelites left Egypt 40 years earlier, there was also a time when there was a lack of water. And there, if we look at Exodus 17, what does God do? God tells Moses to take his staff, to go to a rock, to hit the rock until water comes out. Easy enough. So 40 years ago, if we open up Exodus 17, the Israelites are thirsty, there's no water. God commands Moses to hit the rock. Moses hits the rock, and all is well. But this time, years later, in Numbers 19, we get a seemingly different commandment by God from a very similar circumstance. God says, you and your brother Aaron take the rod, take your staff, and assemble the community. So far, similar to Exodus 17. But then he says, before their eyes, speak to the rock in order to yield water. When you speak to the rock, you shall then produce water to provide drink for the congregations and all of their animals. So in part one, in our earlier deja vu situation, the year after leaving Egypt, Moses strikes the rock to get water. Here, Numbers 19, Moses is commanded to speak to the rock. And perhaps there was a temporary lapse of judgment. Perhaps Moses is recalling his younger days when the way to get water out of rocks was to hit them. For whatever reason, Moses turns around, tells the entire congregation, listen up, you rebels, you people who have been complaining for the last 40 years, I'm going to get water for you. And so in the narrative in this week's Parsha, Moses goes to the rock and strikes it with his staff. And all of a sudden, water comes out. But unlike 40 years ago, there's no happy ending. Sure, the Israelites get water, but the next conversation is God coming to Moshe and saying, because you did this, you're not going to get to go into the land of Israel. And this becomes a question that bothers virtually every biblical commentator that's ever looked at the Torah. Because what's so bad about hitting a rock? Moshe, the one who spent his entire career allowing the Israelites to escape from Egyptian servitude, the one who allowed them to go to Mount Sinai, the person who literally responded to every single one of their requests, the least he can do is be the one to see his vision go to fruition. And all of a sudden, a momentary lapse of judgment striking a rock is going to be the reason why Moshe is metaphorically stuck wandering the desert while the narrative goes on without him. So understandably, we get a whole range of medieval commentators vying for the chance to answer. So we zoom in on 11th century France, and we find Rashi, the great medieval commentator, and Rashi says, don't be so confused. The only reason why Moshe was punished isn't because there's anything objectively wrong with hitting the rock, but it's because Moshe didn't listen to God. If God said speak, you speak. If God says hit, you hit. Now, other commentators aren't as happy with that. And they said, it seemingly still is too big of a punishment for not listening to God for 1 second. And so we turn our attention to medieval Spain, where we get 3 other opinions. Maimonides opines perhaps the actual sin of Moses had nothing to do with whether or not he listened to God or not. Perhaps the reason why Moshe is not allowed to go into Israel after this week's Torah portion is because in hitting the rock, in turning to the congregation and saying, listen, you rebels, he showed a sign of anger. And any sign of anger is not befitting a leader that's going to be able to lead people into the next journey. But again, of course, the subsequent commentators don't like Maimonides' answer, and they say, but wait, Maimonides, Moses has gotten angry plenty of times before, right? If we read through the entirety of the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, there's a whole array of times Moses gets angry. So this can't just be about anger. So we go to the next generation, the Ramban Nachmanides, also a Spanish sage. And he says that Moses' sin wasn't the fact that he ignored God, it wasn't the fact that he got angry, but perhaps Moses' sin was in the suggestion that he was the one responsible for getting the water out of the rock. When he turns to the Israelites, and you can open the book of Numbers in this week's Parsha, Moses says, we will bring water out of this rock. And Nachmanides says, who's this we? Moses should have said, God is going to bring water out of this rock. The second Moses made it about him, that's why God had to put his metaphorical foot down and say, you are not going into Israel. But of course, if you know where this is going, later commentators still aren't happy. So we go to the Ibn Ezra, who gives a somewhat novel reading of this story. And he says that there was no sin in any of Moses' action, right? From hitting the rock, from getting mad at the people, from saying we're going to bring water at the rock, all of that was quote unquote kosher. But the Ibn Ezra said that Moses' true character flaw was waiting to the point where the people had to complain that they were thirsty. If you're a leader and your people have no water, how can you wait until there's already a lack of water, till the people are already so thirsty they're going to cry out to you, without having the foresight to see, if you're the leader, your people need water? There are so many answers to this question, this fundamental question in this week's Torah portion, that Shmuel David Luzzazzo, known as the Shadal, one of the most famous 19th century Italian rabbis, has one of my favorite and funniest biblical commentator quotes of all time. And what he says is that Moshe transgressed one sin in the desert, But the medieval commentators have piled on at least 30 different sins. Each one envisions a new sin. Every single person to comment on this story makes up a new reason why Moses did something wrong. And the Shaddal writes, therefore, I have refrained from studying this chapter intensively because I'm afraid that the more I study this portion, the more I'm going to find a new interpretation, and I'm going to continuously add sins onto the scale of what Moses did wrong. But of course, with all respect to the Shaddal, I want to propose one other way to read this story, one other interpretation as to why round 2 of Moses hitting the rock 40 years later was wrong, whereas 40 years earlier, the hitting of the rock was exactly what he was supposed to do. If we remember back to Exodus, the people that Moshe was addressing, the people that he was a leader for, was a nation of newly freed people. This was at a time when empires of the world were empires that used hegemonic force to bend the entire world, to bend other nations to their will. You know who the first person in the narrative of the Torah was to strike somebody in order to extract a resource? It was the taskmasters in Egypt, right? If we think back to the Passover story, it's the Egyptian taskmasters who are the ones that are ruling by might, that are saying that the way to get something out of somebody, whether it be work out of a person or whether it be water out of a metaphorical rock, the way to impose your will on the world is by physical might. And Moses grew up in this society. And so you can't fault Moses, year 1 out of Egypt, leading his people that have been in servitude for hundreds of years. Perhaps we can't fault Moses for thinking, how do you extract a natural resource? You use force. You use might. But what the Torah is teaching in this week's Torah portion is might does not rule the day anymore. And one of the revolutions of the Torah, one of the things that Judaism brought to the world, is the foundational idea that our words, the way we speak, have the power to create and destroy. At times, and this has certainly been true throughout history, words, whether positive words and negative words, have more power than any staff, than any weapon possibly can. We know, according to the Torah, the way that God creates the world is with speech, to teach us the lesson that every time we say something, every time we open our mouths, whether our words are positive or negative, we have the power to create and destroy. The common magical phrase, abracadabra, actually comes from a Hebrew word, meaning this exact thing, right? If we think about the root of the word, abra comes from abera, right? Aleph in front of a word is I. Bara, from Bereshit bara, is create. So abera, I will create. Kedabra, ke means with, the prefix in Hebrew. And daber is words. Even the spell, the idea that we can create something with our words, was a Jewish revolution. The idea of the Torah, the entire reason why it took 40 years, is because this is a radical new idea. An idea that says that society, that our interaction with others, has to be organized by words and not by violence. And so when Moses hit the rock, it wasn't necessarily that he was punished for it, but it symbolized the fact that his leadership was necessarily over. The society and the ideals that the Jewish people are going to subsequently go on to set up in Israel is not a society of striking the rock. It's a society where ideas and values and resources and society is made up of people talking to each other. And if Moses' upbringing, if his education, if his career was in a different situation, he wasn't the leader that was fit to bring the Jewish people into that next generation. Our society today, be it big picture American society, be it the way people talk to each other on a global scale, we live in a society where it feels like everybody who has a different worldview than us, if people disagree politically, if people disagree religiously, if people disagree on any social issue, they oftentimes seem to us like they're a rock, right? We try throwing ideas at them, but they're just too dense, they're too rigid, right? It seems like they're stoic. How can the other side of any issue, how can people who disagree with me, how can others not get it? Why do they seem so rigid in their ways? And sometimes, when things get tough enough, we think, if only we can strike out at that rock, right? If only the way to solve problems in the world, if only the way to facilitate a healthy society, a society that has water, a society that can survive and thrive, we sometimes imagine if only we can get rid of those other people, if only we can take out our staff and hit them. But what we learn from this week's Parsha is that this is a delusion. What we learn from this week's Parsha is it may seem like oftentimes when we're speaking to those who disagree with us, when we're talking to those who don't share our worldview, it can oftentimes seem like we're talking to a rock and seem like our words have no effect. But what we learn from this week's Parsha is that if only we find the right words, if only we give it a chance, if only our immediate conclusion isn't to jump to violence, whether that be the violence of physical actions or the violence of hurtful words, if only we can find the right words, who knows, even something that seems as stubborn and rigid and unmovable as a rock can also go forth and produce water. Shabbat Shalom. We continue with Aleinu on page 588.
והשבותה אל לבבך והשבותה אל לבבך נאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו
Before we recite Mourner's Kaddish on page 598, we want to highlight people in the community that are in the unique Jewish stages of mourning this Shabbat. If you are in the week after the passing of a loved one, feel free to type their name into the chat or to the comment section. If this is the Shloshim period, the 30 days after the passing, please write their name. If this is the first year of mourning, please take a moment and write the name. And if you are commemorating a yahrzeit this Shabbat, please write their name. Everybody else, please join us for Mourner's Kaddish on page 598. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, b'alma dibra kirtei v'amlich malchutei, b'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uv'zman kariv v'yimru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach leolam omei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitale v'yitala shmei d'kudisha brichu. Le'el amin kol berchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechamata damiran b'alma v'yimru amen. Yehei shalom Rabbah min shamayim v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimveru amen. Oseh shalom min Ramav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimveru amen.
Amen.
We turn to page 122 for the Kiddush. And while I grab my grape juice, if anybody has grape juice or wine, feel free to take a moment to grab it to do Kiddush with us. Vayhi erev vayhi boker yom hashishi, vayichulu hashamayim va'aretz v'chotz ba'am, vayichal Elohim b'yom hashi melachto asher asa v'yishpot b'yom hashvi'i, mikol melachto asher asa v'yirech Elohim et yom hashvi'i v'yikadesh oto, ki bo Shabbat mikol melachto asher bara Elohim la'asot savrim ra'anan, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kishanim mitzotav v'ratza ba'anu, v'shabbat kodsho b'yavar tzon inchilanu, זיכרון למעשה בראשית, כי יום תחילה למקרה קודש, זכר ליציאת מצרים, כי בנו בחרת, ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים, ושבת קדשך באהבה וברצון הנחתנו, ברוך אתה אדוני, מקדש השבת.
Amen.
Shabbat Shalom, L'chaim. And we finish services with Shalom Rav on page 178.
Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Ki ata melech adon lechol hashalom. Ki ata melech adon lechol hashalom. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. אליך לברך את עמך ישראל בכל עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. שלום רב על ישראל עמך תשים לעולם. שלום רב על ישראל עמך תשים לעולם. תשים לעולם.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll see you all tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.